At 9:30 in the morning, on August 15, 1942, the tanker SS Ohio was being dragged into Grand Harbor, Malta. She did not enter like a ship. She entered like wreckage that had refused to finish sinking. Her hull was torn. Her engines were silent. Smoke stains ran across her sides. Steel plates had buckled from bomb blasts. Somewhere beneath her deck, men could still smell oil, salt water, burned paint, and the sour metal scent that came after explosions. The ropes holding her were under strain. Destroyers pressed close, not as escorts now, but almost as crutches, keeping her upright long enough to reach the harbor wall. On the quayside, Maltese civilians watched with faces that had become too tired to celebrate easily. Many had spent nights underground, listening to bombs fall through limestone dust. Children had learned to tell the difference between aircraft by sound. Dock workers had unloaded cargo under falling debris. Nurses had treated burns in rooms that shook with each raid. And now they were looking at a tanker. Not a victory parade. Not a captured flag. Not a clean military triumph. A tanker. Because inside that damaged hull was fuel, and by August 1942 fuel meant life. Fuel meant aircraft could climb again. Fuel meant submarines could leave harbor again. Fuel meant trucks could move. Fuel meant Malta could keep breathing. For the men watching from Axis command rooms across the Mediterranean, this was not just a British ship arriving after a hard voyage. It was something more troubling. It was proof that the island had not been killed. Italian commanders had once looked at Malta and seen a small British possession in the middle of an Italian sea. A rocky place. A fortress, yes, but a limited one. An irritation. A base that could be bombed, starved, isolated, and eventually made useless. That belief had not been foolish at first. Malta was close to Sicily. Axis aircraft could reach it again and again. Its harbors could be struck. Its airfields could be cratered. Its convoys could be attacked before they arrived. The civilians could be pushed into shelters. Its soldiers could be worn down by hunger and exhaustion. On a map, Malta looked vulnerable. But maps have a way of lying when men trust them too much. The commanders who saw Malta as a target did not fully understand what the island had become. They saw land. They did not see the network inside it. They did not see the mechanics patching aircraft by lamplight. They did not see the submarine crews waiting for darkness. They did not see the radar operators, the dock workers, the anti-aircraft gunners, the pilots, the nurses, the civilians carrying buckets through dust after another street had collapsed. They did not see that Malta's greatest strength was not its size. It was its position. From that position, the island could reach into the Axis supply routes to North Africa, could threaten convoys carrying fuel to Rommel's army, could delay ships, force escorts, draw aircraft away from other fronts, turn a simple crossing into a calculation of loss. The Axis could bomb Malta, but they could not move it, and that was the problem. As the Ohio crept into Grand Harbor barely alive, the island's defenders were not thinking in the language of grand strategy. Some were thinking of bread, some of petrol, some of whether the next raid would come before the cargo was unloaded. A sailor might have looked down at the black water along the tanker's side and wondered how much longer the ropes would hold. But in the larger war, something had become clear. Malta had survived the attempt to erase it. And because it had survived, the Mediterranean War would continue to bleed through the same narrow sea lanes that Italian commanders had hoped to control. They had believed Malta was an island. But the war was beginning to show them something else. It was a weapon that did not need to move. And the first mistake had been made long before the Ohio entered the harbor. It began with the belief that geography was simple. The island under Italy's shadow. From Sicily, Malta seemed almost close enough to touch. On clear days, the sea between them could appear deceptively calm. A blue strip of water that looked less like a battlefield than a boundary on a classroom map. Italian planners understood its position, of course. They had studied it. They knew the distances. They knew the harbor at Valletta. They knew the British had held Malta for generations. But knowing where something is not the same as understanding what it can do. To Italian commanders in 1940, Malta was a British thorn planted in the central Mediterranean. Annoying. dangerous if ignored, but not impossible to neutralize. Italy had entered the war with naval pride, airfields in Sicily, and the confidence of a country that believed the Mediterranean could become Mare Nostrum again, our sea. The logic seemed strong. Malta was small. It had limited space for aircraft. Its runways were exposed. Its harbors were visible from the air. Its population could not escape. Its supply lines depended on convoys from the west or east, and every convoy had to cross waters where submarines, aircraft, and warships could wait. If enough bombs fell, the airfields would stop functioning. If enough ships were sunk, supplies would run out. If enough civilians suffered, morale would crack. If enough pressure was applied, Malta would become a dead fortress. Still British on paper, perhaps, but useless in practice. This was what they believed, and for a time the belief looked reasonable. The first raids came with the cold rhythm of modern war. Engines overhead, sirens, anti-aircraft bursts, glass falling into streets, people running for shelters. Bombs struck docks, workshops, homes, churches, supply areas, airfields. Smoke climbed into the sunlight. Men came out after the all-clear and found familiar streets rearranged into stone piles. Malta was not a romantic fortress. It was crowded, hot, dusty, and increasingly hungry. When bombs fell near the harbor, the blast did not simply damage military targets. It entered kitchens, tore through bedrooms. It pushed air through shelter entrances and left people coughing in the dark. In Rome, the island could be discussed as a military problem. On Malta, it was a daily pressure against the body. Still, the island did not become silent. This was the part Italian commanders had not fully measured. A runway could be cratered in the morning and patched by evening. A workshop could lose tools and still continue with borrowed hands. A dock could burn and still unload cargo when the next ship arrived. A family could lose a home and still send a son back to an anti-aircraft battery. War on an island compresses everything. There is no rear area in the normal sense. Civilians, sailors, pilots, mechanics, doctors, and soldiers all live under the same sky. A bomb meant for an airfield can kill a child. A civilian shelter can sit close to a military store. A dock worker can become as important to the war as a pilot. That was Malta's strange power. It turned survival into a military act. Italian commanders were not blind. They knew Malta had value. They knew it interfered with sea routes. They knew Britain wanted to keep it. But many still understood it as something that could be reduced by pressure, as if the island's usefulness were a surface that could be scraped away. They underestimated the stubborn machinery beneath. The people on Malta began to live by routines that were almost impossible to explain to anyone far away. You slept when you could. You ate what was available. You listened for aircraft. You learned not to look too long at ruins because the next job was waiting. Mechanics worked with tired fingers. Gunners stayed beside their weapons through heat and dust. Nurses washed blood from floors that would shake again the next day. The island was being damaged. But damage was not the same as defeat. And while the Axis counted bombs dropped, Malta's defenders counted something else. Aircraft repaired, ships unloaded, submarines sent out, convoys attacked, minutes gained. The difference mattered. Because the real war around Malta was not only being fought in its streets. It was being fought across the water, where Axis supply ships moved south toward Africa with fuel in their tanks, ammunition in their holds, and men on deck watching the horizon. The island under Italy's shadow was not waiting passively. It was watching the road to North Africa, and that road was made of water. The road to Africa was made of water. The Desert War was often filmed and remembered through tanks. Steel silhouettes under a white sun, dust rising behind columns. German and Italian vehicles moving across open ground. British armor waiting behind ridges. Names like Tobruk, Gazala, El Alamein. Commanders studying maps in tents while the wind pushed sand against canvas. But the Desert War did not begin in the desert. It began in ports. It began with cranes, cargo nets, oil drums, ammunition crates, spare engines, sacks of flour, medical supplies, tires, radio parts, and men with clipboards trying to make arithmetic survive contact with weather and enemy action. An army in North Africa needed everything carried to it. Fuel did not grow in Libya. Tank tracks did not repair themselves. Ammunition fired once was gone forever unless another ship delivered more. A commander could plan an offensive across the desert, but the plan meant nothing if the petrol cans did not arrive. This was the hidden problem. The Axis war in North Africa depended on convoys moving across the Mediterranean. Ships had to leave Italian ports, cross dangerous water, reach North African harbors, unload under threat, and then somehow push those supplies hundreds of miles inland over poor roads, through dust, heat, mechanical wear, and enemy air attack. Every stage consumed time. Every stage consumed fuel. Every stage could fail. From a distance, a convoy looked like a solution. Ships carrying cargo from one shore to another. But for the men aboard, it was a long exposure to danger. Merchant sailors knew their ships were not battleships. They carried cargo, and cargo could burn. Fuel could explode. Ammunition could tear a vessel apart from inside. A torpedo did not need to sink every ship to damage the convoy's purpose. It only had to slow it, scatter it, force escorts to rescue survivors, or make commanders reroute future sailings. Malta sat near the heart of this equation. From the island, British aircraft, submarines, and surface forces could threaten the sea lanes to Libya. Even when Malta was short of fuel and aircraft, its mere presence forced Axis planners to think differently. A convoy could not be treated as a simple crossing. It had to be defended, timed, hidden, escorted, sometimes rerouted. Ships that should have been carrying cargo needed protection. Aircraft that might have supported the front had to bomb Malta or guard convoys. Fuel had to be spent protecting fuel. That was the trap. Italian commanders were trying to sustain an African campaign across a sea that contained a British base they could not fully silence. It was not that they failed to understand shipping. Italian naval officers understood the sea. Many were skilled, disciplined, and brave. The Regia Marina fought under severe constraints, including fuel shortages and strategic pressures beyond the control of individual sailors. Convoy escorts often did their work with courage that deserves respect. But the larger system was cruel. Even bravery could not change geography. A merchant captain leaving for North Africa might have known very little about grand strategy. He knew the ship's speed. He knew the cargo. He knew the weather. He knew whether the crew looked rested or hollow-eyed. He knew that somewhere beyond the dark line of sea there might be a submarine from Malta waiting at periscope depth, or an aircraft coming low enough that a lookout might hear engines only seconds before the attack. On a calm sea, fear has more space. Men listen harder. A chain knocks against metal and someone turns his head too quickly. A radio crackles and the bridge goes quiet. A flare appears where there should be darkness. The imagination fills the rest before the enemy does. This was the kind of war Malta imposed. Not one dramatic battle, but repeated pressure. Convoy delayed here. A tanker lost there. Cargo ship damaged. Escorts diverted. Aircraft reassigned. Schedules disrupted. North African ports congested. Supplies arriving late or arriving without the fuel needed to move them forward. To the Axis soldier in the desert, Malta might have seemed far away. He might never see the island. He might only know its effect as an absence. The fuel truck did not arrive. The spare part was missing. The ration was reduced. The aircraft cover was weaker than promised. The offensive was delayed. In war, absence can kill as surely as a shell. This was what Italian commanders would come to understand too late. Malta's power was not measured by the size of its garrison. It was measured by the uncertainty it injected into every movement across the central Mediterranean. And yet, there was another problem. For Malta to remain dangerous, Malta itself had to survive. By 1942, that survival was no longer guaranteed. The island could disrupt the road to Africa only if its own road from the outside world stayed open. And that road was becoming a graveyard. The people who kept the island alive. There were days on Malta when the island seemed to be held together by hands. Not by speeches. Not by strategy papers. Hands. Hands carrying stones from bomb streets. Hands pushing stretchers through dust. Hands tightening bolts on aircraft that had landed hard on damaged runways. Hands lifting ammunition crates. hands clearing glass, hands covering children's ears in shelters when the engines came back. The island's survival depended on people who rarely appeared in the clean lines of campaign maps. A mechanic kneeling under a fighter with oil on his sleeve. A dock worker standing near a cargo net while dust from the last raid still hung over the harbor. An anti-aircraft gunner rubbing grit from his eyes, trying to stay alert after too little sleep. A nurse pausing for one breath before turning to the next wounded man. A mother counting children in the dark after the shelter lights flickered. These were not symbolic figures. They were the working parts of Malta's resistance. Italian and German aircraft could crater runways. But craters had to remain open to matter. If men filled them fast enough, if crushed stone and labor could turn broken ground back into landing ground, then the bomb had only interrupted the island. It had not silenced it. They could bomb workshops. But if tools were recovered, if parts were improvised, if damaged aircraft were cannibalized so one machine could fly again, then destruction became temporary. They could bomb docks. But if cargo was unloaded before the next raid, the island had gained another day. And Malta lived in days. One more day with aircraft in the air. One more day with food in storage. One more night with submarines able to leave harbor. One more convoy unloaded. One more repair completed before morning. This kind of endurance is easy to admire from far away and difficult to understand up close. It was not clean courage. It was fatigue, irritation, hunger, fear. Men snapping at each other, then returning to work because the job was still there. Civilians growing used to things no one should grow used to. Children learning silence too early. Doctors making decisions with too many patients and not enough supplies. A man can become brave for 1 minute. Malta had to be brave for months. The island's defenders understood something that many commanders away from the fighting learned more slowly. A base is not only concrete, fuel tanks, guns, and runways. A base is people maintaining function under pressure. Without mechanics, aircraft are ornaments. Without dock workers, cargo remains trapped in holds. Without radar operators and observers, warning comes too late. Without civilians enduring the punishment around them, the garrison becomes an isolated military shell inside a collapsing society. The George Cross awarded to Malta was not an abstract honor. It recognized something that had already been visible in the streets. The island had been asked to absorb punishment far beyond the normal limits of a military base, and it had not stopped functioning. But endurance carried a danger of its own. The longer Malta survived, the more the Axis needed to crush it. And the harder the Axis pressed, the more Malta had to make decisions that seemed almost irrational. A starving island should conserve strength. A starving island should hide what little it had. A starving island should wait. Malta could not, because if Malta merely endured, the Axis convoys would pass. If the convoys passed, North Africa would be supplied. If North Africa was supplied, the pressure on the British armies in Egypt would grow. And if the desert front turned against the Allies, Malta's isolation would become worse. So the island had to do something cruelly difficult. It had to fight while hungry. It had to spend fuel to deny fuel. It had to risk aircraft to stop the enemy's aircraft from being sustained. It had to send submarines into the same sea that was strangling it. This was the idea that would have looked reckless in a calm office. But Malta was not living in a calm office. It was living under engines, sirens, dust, and the knowledge that survival without action might only delay defeat. And so, while bombs kept falling, the island prepared not only to endure, prepared to strike. Use the island while it is starving. There is a particular cruelty in asking exhausted men to become dangerous. Not just to survive. Not just to repair what was broken. But to go back out and strike. On Malta, this was the choice. By 1942, the island was under enormous strain. Food was short. Fuel was precious. Aircraft were few enough that every machine carried weight beyond its metal. A damaged engine was not simply a maintenance problem. It was a question of whether one less patrol would fly, whether one convoy would go unspotted, whether one enemy tanker might slip through. In ordinary military logic, a besieged base conserves. It waits. It reduces unnecessary risk. But Malta's position made caution dangerous. If the island stopped attacking, Axis convoys could move more freely. If those convoys arrived, fuel and ammunition reached North Africa. If North Africa was strengthened, the entire Allied position in Egypt came under greater threat. So the island's defenders faced a strange equation. Every gallon of aviation fuel used from Malta might help destroy many more gallons headed for the Axis. Every submarine patrol risked a boat and crew, but might stop cargo that would later feed enemy guns. Every aircraft sent out might not return, but every aircraft kept on the ground allowed the enemy's shipping system to breathe. This was not heroism in a clean sense. It was arithmetic under pressure. Pilots knew it in the body. Before takeoff, a man could feel the aircraft vibrating beneath him, smell fuel, leather, sweat, and hot metal. He knew the island was short of everything. He knew a mistake on landing might wreck a machine that mechanics had kept alive through raids and shortages. He knew that beyond the runway, the sea opened into a place where enemy fighters, flak, bad weather, and mechanical failure all waited without caring about courage. A submarine commander knew it differently. Inside a boat, the air grew stale. Men spoke quietly because sound felt larger underwater. The steel around them was protection and prison at once. A patrol from Malta was not a gesture. It was hours of listening, watching, calculating, waiting for the shape of a convoy to appear in the wrong patch of sea. The idea was simple enough. Malta must remain offensive. The cost was not simple. Some commanders understood the need. Others, farther away, sometimes saw only reports, aircraft serviceability rates, fuel stocks, tonnage, convoy schedules. Numbers could suggest logic. But numbers did not show the mechanic trying to make one aircraft out of parts from 3. They did not show the pilot climbing into a cockpit after too little sleep. They did not show a civilian shelter after a raid, when people waited before stepping outside because the first silence after bombing could feel suspicious. The Axis believed pressure would narrow Malta's options. It did, but not in the way they hoped. Pressure did not make Malta irrelevant. It made every decision sharper. Every sortie mattered more. Every patrol carried more meaning. Every ship unloaded in harbor became not merely supply, but possibility. The island became a place where small acts had strategic consequences. A runway patched before nightfall meant fighters could rise tomorrow. A tanker unloaded under threat meant offensive patrols could continue. A submarine repaired in time meant a convoy might be intercepted days later. An observer's warning meant aircraft were not destroyed on the ground. This is how Malta resisted becoming only a victim, turned its suffering outward. For Italian commanders, this created a deeper frustration. Bombing could damage Malta, but damage did not always translate into operational silence. Starvation could weaken the island, but weakness did not stop it from being dangerous. Every time Malta seemed close to exhaustion, some part of the island's war machine continued to work. Not perfectly, not without loss, but enough. And in convoy warfare, enough can be devastating. Enough aircraft to force evasive routes. Enough submarines to make captains fear the dark. Enough intelligence to know where to look. Enough fuel to keep the threat alive. The Axis did not need Malta to be strong to suffer from it. They only needed Malta to remain active. That was the hidden cruelty of the island's position. A weakened Malta could still hurt. A hungry Malta could still hunt. And soon, in the black water of the central Mediterranean, Italian convoy crews would feel the difference between an island that had been bombed and an island that had been silenced. They were not the same thing. Convoy night in the central Mediterranean. At night, the sea can make a man doubt his own eyes. A lookout on an Italian escort vessel might stare into darkness until the horizon began to invent shapes. The water moved in low black folds. The ship's engines trembled through the deck. Somewhere aft, men spoke quietly near ready ammunition. On the bridge, officers watched the convoy's formation and listened to radio messages clipped by static. Every sound mattered. A loose chain, a change in engine pitch, a voice too sharp, a report from another ship. The cargo vessels behind them were slow, heavy, and necessary. They carried the substance of the desert war, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, food, men. They were the reason the escorts existed. Without them, the army in North Africa became a promise without a body. The convoy had to keep moving. That was the trap. A warship can maneuver. A convoy must protect its slowest, most vulnerable members. Cannot scatter every time danger is suspected. Cannot stop and think. It must move through a dangerous area as a group, while every submarine, aircraft, or surface force needs only one opening. Somewhere beyond the convoy's darkened line, Malta waited. Not visibly, not as cliffs or harbor lights, but as a possibility in every officer's mind. A submarine might already be there, running silent at periscope depth. An aircraft might be crossing low over the sea, its crew straining to find the convoy before fuel forced them home. A signal might have been intercepted. A report might have reached the island before the convoy even entered the danger zone. The men aboard the Italian ships were not cowards. Many did their work with discipline under conditions that worsened month by month. They knew what a burning tanker looked like at night. They knew how fast fire could turn cargo into a death sentence. They knew that if a ship carrying ammunition went up, distance might not save the men watching from another deck. A torpedo strike did not always look dramatic at first. Sometimes there was a flash, a heavy concussion, then a pause in which men seemed to wait for the ship to decide whether it was dying. Then came steam, shouting, the angle of a deck changing underfoot, emergency lights, men running toward stations they had practiced for and hoped never to use. Aircraft attack was different, came with sound, engines low over water, anti-aircraft guns hammering upward, tracer fire climbing into the dark. A pilot holding course longer than seemed reasonable because the release point was not yet reached. A ship turning hard, too slow to feel agile, while men watched the shape of an incoming aircraft become visible for a few seconds before everything became noise. This was the reality Malta helped create. Not a clean duel, not a single decisive confrontation, a repeated state of tension, where every convoy became a wager. Italian commanders believed Malta could be reduced to a passive target. But in the convoy lanes, Malta was active in a way that did not require a large fleet or a massive army. It used position. It used timing. It used aircraft when it had them, submarines when they could sail, intelligence when it could be turned into action, and the simple fact that Axis ships had to pass through reach. A convoy might survive. Many did, but survival was not the same as success. If ships arrived late, the desert waited. If cargo was damaged, calculations changed. If escorts had burned too much fuel, future operations suffered. If fear forced a longer route, the cost grew. If a tanker was sunk, an entire offensive might feel the absence weeks later. War at sea often hides its consequences. A ship goes down in one place. A tank stops moving in another. Pilot cannot fly because fuel never arrived. An infantryman receives fewer shells because ammunition was lost before he ever saw the enemy. This chain was Malta's battlefield. And it is why Italian frustration deepened. Their sailors could fight well. Their escorts could defend hard. Their commanders could adjust routes and schedules. But every adjustment acknowledged the same fact. Malta had changed the movement of the war. The island forced the Axis to think about it even when no Maltese coastline was visible. That is a particular kind of power. The power to occupy the enemy's planning table. And with every convoy, the cost grew less like an exception and more like a pattern. At first, commanders could explain losses as bad luck, poor timing, British persistence, or the normal price of war. But patterns are harder to dismiss. And Malta was becoming a pattern written in fuel, wreckage, and delay. The island that made every route longer. A route on a map is a calm thing. A line drawn from Italy to North Africa. A measured distance. Planning problem. But ships do not sail across maps. They sail through weather, fear, engine trouble, enemy sightings, bad intelligence, and the knowledge that one mistake can spread fire through a hold full of fuel. Malta made every route feel longer. Even when the distance did not change, the risk did. A convoy commander could not simply ask, "How far is the port?" He had to ask, "What aircraft might reach us?" What submarines have sailed? How many escorts can we spare? Should we travel by night? Should we take a wider route? Will the delay matter at the front? Can the cargo survive if the convoy is attacked? Can the escorts? Each question consumed attention. Attention is also a resource in war. The Axis needed to supply North Africa, fight the British, protect shipping, bomb Malta, preserve naval fuel, manage aircraft losses, and answer demands from multiple theaters. Malta sat in the middle of those pressures like a stone in a shoe that could not be removed. The island did not have to sink every convoy. It only had to make the system less reliable. Reliability is what armies live on. A general can plan with fewer supplies if he knows exactly when they arrive. What destroys planning is uncertainty. Fuel promised but delayed. Ammunition expected but lost. Vehicles unloaded but without spare parts. Food delivered to a port but stuck far from the front. A convoy that survives but arrives too late to influence the battle it was meant to support. Malta manufactured uncertainty. This is where the Italian realization became sharper. The island's danger was not only physical. It was operational. It forced protective behavior. It pulled resources toward itself. It made convoy planning defensive. It turned movement into exposure. The Axis response was heavy and often brutal. Malta was bombed again and again. Its ports, airfields, and cities were struck. The population endured a siege that pushed daily life into exhaustion. Plans to invade the island existed. The idea of removing Malta physically from the board was not ignored. But timing is unforgiving. A strategic problem solved late may still be a strategic failure. By the time the Axis understood the full weight of Malta's position, other pressures had grown. North Africa demanded supply. The Eastern Front demanded aircraft and attention. Naval fuel was limited. German and Italian priorities did not always align cleanly. Every decision carried a cost somewhere else. Meanwhile, Malta kept returning from damage. Not fully. Not easily. Sometimes barely. But enough to remain a threat. Then came Operation Pedestal. In August 1942, the British threw a heavily protected convoy toward Malta because the island situation had become desperate. The convoy was battered. Ships were lost. Men died in burning water. Aircraft attacked. Submarines struck. Warships fought to keep the supply effort alive. The price was severe. But the arrival of enough supplies, especially the battered Ohio and her fuel, changed the island's immediate future. It did not make Malta safe. It made Malta dangerous again. That was the reversal. The Axis had tried to starve Malta into silence. Instead, the island survived long enough to resume pressure on the sea lanes that fed the Axis army in Africa. For Italian commanders, this was the hard truth. Malta was not a problem that stayed solved. It had to be suppressed constantly. The moment pressure eased, the island's position began to matter again. A bombed runway could be repaired. A damaged harbor could unload. A weakened garrison could recover enough strength to hurt. The island's geography did not need rest. It waded through everything. This was why Malta was not just an island. An island is land surrounded by water. Malta was land positioned inside the enemy's bloodstream. Every Axis convoy to North Africa passed through a war shaped by its presence. And once the island revived, the desert felt it. Because a tank waiting for fuel does not care why the ship is late. It only knows it cannot move. Tons, miles, minutes, fuel. The desert war can be reduced to one hard truth. Machines need fuel. Not glory. Not speeches. Not confidence. Fuel. A tank without fuel is cover for infantry, and not very good cover for long. A truck without fuel becomes cargo instead of transport. An aircraft without fuel is an expensive shape on the ground. A commander without fuel can still give orders, but the orders travel no farther than the legs of tired men. This was the mathematics Malta forced into the Axis war. The numbers were not only about ships sunk. That is the easy way to measure naval war, and sometimes the misleading one. The deeper question was what each loss did to the system around it. A tanker lost at sea did not simply remove fuel from a ledger. It removed movement from the future. It removed flying hours. It removed armored range. It removed the ability to exploit success. It might mean an attack delayed, a retreat made harder, a supply column shortened, or a formation told to hold when it needed to move. A cargo ship damaged but not sunk still mattered. Repairs took time. Escorts had to assist. Convoy speed might drop. Port schedules might become congested. Men who should be unloading one ship were dealing with another that arrived damaged. Delay spread outward. A convoy forced to sail farther burned more fuel to deliver fuel. That was the bitter logic. Malta's influence lived inside these small multiplications. A few aircraft sorties, a submarine patrol, a damaged merchantman, a route altered, an escort assigned, a delay accepted. None of these alone explains the Mediterranean War. Together, repeated month after month, they changed the pressure on North Africa. What matters is not only the number. What matters is what the number reveals. If a convoy loses a tanker, the desert feels it later. If aircraft must be used to suppress Malta, they are not somewhere else. If escorts are tied to supply routes, they cannot be freely concentrated for other operations. If commanders must plan around an island, then the island has already entered their command structure. This is the kind of victory that does not always produce a dramatic photograph. There is no single moment when arithmetic salutes. Instead, the evidence appears in shortages, delays, and choices that become narrower over time. An officer at the front asks when fuel will arrive. A logistics officer gives an answer with uncertainty inside it. A tank crew waits. A pilot is told sorties must be limited. A convoy planner studies another route that is longer, safer perhaps, but slower. And somewhere in the middle of the sea, Malta remains. Italian commanders were not wrong to respect British naval power. They were not wrong to fear air attack. They were not wrong to protect convoys. Their mistake was more subtle. They underestimated how much cumulative damage a small, well-positioned base could impose without winning a conventional battle. Malta did not need to destroy the Axis Navy. It needed to make supply unreliable. It needed to turn the Mediterranean crossing into a contest every time. The island's own survival had the same arithmetic. A few more tons of fuel meant more patrols. A few repaired aircraft meant more interceptions. A few hours of dock work before the next raid meant more food stored, more ammunition moved, more medical supplies distributed. A single tanker like Ohio could matter not because it was romantic, but because it carried the means for the island to keep functioning. This is where human effort and arithmetic met. The mechanic tightening a bolt was part of the numbers. The dock worker unloading in smoke was part of the numbers. The gunner staying awake beside an anti-aircraft weapon was part of the numbers. The submarine crew leaving harbor in foul air and silence was part of the numbers. War turns people into statistics in reports. But before they become numbers, they are bodies doing work under fear. And the price was paid by bodies. On Malta, at sea, in Italian escort ships, in British merchant vessels, in aircraft that did not return, in shelters where civilians waited for the next sound overhead. The mathematics of survival was never clean. It counted the living by counting what had not yet been lost. And Malta had not yet been lost. The price of keeping Malta alive. Victory in a place like Malta did not arrive with clean hands. It came through smoke, hunger, grief, and the daily punishment of people who had no option except to continue. There were civilians who measured the war by the sounds above them. The siren, the engines, the blast, the strange pause after impact when dust moves before people do. In shelters, the air could grow warm and stale. Children slept against adults who were pretending not to be afraid. Somewhere above, streets they knew were being broken into shapes they would not recognize. After raids, people emerged carefully. There is a way survivors walk after bombing. Not slowly because there is time, but slowly because the world may have changed under their feet. Corner gone. A doorway blocked. A familiar wall opened to the sky. Someone calling a name and receiving no answer. Military language calls this civilian morale. The words are too clean. Morale is a mother deciding whether to let her child see the street. It is a dock worker returning to the harbor because cargo has to be unloaded. It is a nurse washing her hands and turning to the next patient before she has finished thinking about the last one. On the convoys, the cost had another shape. Men drowned in oil-black water. Men burned on decks that could not be abandoned because the ship still carried cargo the island needed. Sailors fought fires knowing that beneath them might be fuel or ammunition. A merchant ship was not only a vessel, it was a container of consequences. If it survived, Malta lived longer. If it burned, the island felt the loss in kitchens, hangars, hospitals, and fuel stores. The Italian side paid too. It is easy, in a story about Malta, to turn Italian sailors into faceless opponents. That would be false. Many of them were men doing a brutal job under growing danger. They escorted convoys because an army depended on them. They watched for torpedoes, aircraft, mines, and the sudden violence of a sea that could change in seconds. They knew that if they failed, men in the desert would suffer. They also knew that even if they succeeded, the next convoy would come, and the danger would begin again. War rarely allows clean moral distance at the level of the man doing the work. An Italian sailor on an escort ship and a Maltese dock worker under bombing were enemies inside the same machine of necessity. Each tried to keep his side alive. Each could be killed by decisions made far from the place where death arrived. That is why Malta's story has weight. It was not only a contest of strategy. It was a test of endurance inflicted on ordinary people by geography and command ambition. The Axis wanted Malta neutralized because Malta threatened their war in Africa. The British had to hold Malta because losing it would open the central Mediterranean more fully to Axis movement. Civilians endured because they lived where empires had placed value. Sailors died because cargo had to cross water. Pilots flew because a convoy somewhere might determine a battle elsewhere. The island became a place where every human act had more meaning than it should have had to carry. A mechanic was not just repairing an aircraft. He was helping protect a convoy. A nurse was not just treating a wound. She was preserving the human strength of a besieged population. A sailor was not just holding a course. He was carrying the next week of resistance. This is how war compresses life until ordinary work becomes unbearable in importance. And still the reports came in formal language. Tonnage delivered. Ships lost. Aircraft destroyed. Runways damaged. Sorties flown. Civilian casualties. Operational capability. The reports were necessary. Commanders needed them. But they could not capture the whole truth. They could not show the way a man's hands shook after unloading cargo under attack, or the way silence settled after a bombing raid when everyone waited to learn whose house had gone. By late 1942, the truth of Malta was visible in both suffering and persistence. The island had been punished terribly, but punishment had not achieved the intended result. It had not made Malta irrelevant. And now the commanders who had hoped to reduce it had to face a more bitter conclusion. They had spent aircraft, bombs, ships, fuel, time, and men trying to silence a base whose greatest weapon was not its strength at any single moment, but its refusal to stop matching. Recognition came, but recognition came late. Too late in the reports. Commanders often discover failure in stages. First, a setback is temporary. Then it is inconvenient. Then it is explained by weather, timing, shortages, enemy luck, insufficient force, poor coordination. Only later does the pattern become too large to excuse. Malta followed that path. The Axis understood the island was important. They bombed it heavily. They tried to starve it. They planned around it. They discussed invasion. They knew it interfered with convoys. No serious commander in the Mediterranean could pretend Malta did not exist. But acknowledging a problem is not the same as solving it. The deeper failure lay in timing, priorities, and the inability to convert pressure into final removal. Malta was always competing with something else. North Africa needed supplies. The Eastern Front consumed German attention. Aircraft were needed in multiple theaters. Naval fuel was limited. Invasion was risky. Delay became policy by accumulation. Every postponement left Malta in place. And a Malta in place was a Malta that could recover. This was the command room frustration. A bombing campaign could reduce Malta's strength, but unless the island was permanently neutralized, the effect decayed. Runways were repaired. Aircraft arrived. Fuel came in through desperate convoys. Submarines returned to patrol. The island's offensive pulse weakened, then strengthened, then weakened again, but it did not disappear when it mattered most. Reports could show damage, but reports could also conceal resilience. A commander might read that an airfield had been struck. He might not see the men already moving to fill craters. He might read that harbor facilities were damaged. He might not see dock workers unloading through smoke. He might read that Malta's supplies were low. He might not see how low supplies could still produce enough action to hurt convoys. This is where belief collided with battlefield reality. The belief: Malta could be made useless by sustained pressure. The reality: Malta's usefulness came from geography, and geography remained even when buildings burned. As long as the island could support some aircraft, some submarines, some intelligence, some repair work, and some offensive action, it remained a threat. It did not need to be healthy. It needed to be alive. Italian commanders realized this more clearly as the North African supply struggle worsened. The convoy routes remained dangerous. Escort requirements remained heavy. Losses and delays continued to matter. And as the wider war shifted against the Axis, the chance to deal with Malta decisively faded. By the time the island was no longer merely surviving but again operating with renewed strength, the strategic situation had changed. The Allies were gaining momentum. North Africa was becoming harder to sustain. The Mediterranean was turning from an Axis ambition into an Allied avenue. Later, Malta would support wider Allied operations. The same island that Italy had hoped to neutralize became part of the chain that helped open the road towards Sicily and Italy itself. There is a severe irony in that. The island under Italy's shadow became a platform for the war's return toward Italy. For the men in command, this was not a single dramatic moment of revelation. It was more likely a series of unwelcome recognitions. Another convoy lost, another route threatened, another operation delayed, another report showing that Malta still had teeth. Wars are often lost through such accumulations. Not one mistake, a pattern of misjudgment. Not one ignored fact, a fact understood too late. Malta's lesson was not hidden. It was visible every time a convoy had to be escorted, every time aircraft were diverted, every time supply failed to arrive as planned, every time the desert front asked for what the sea had not delivered. They had seen the island. They had not fully understood the system. And once they did, the system had already done its work. The unsinkable base. Malta's legacy is not that it was invincible. It was not. The island was hungry, bombed, damaged, exhausted. Its people suffered deeply. Its defenses were strained. Its airfields were hit. Its convoys were mauled. More than once, its survival became a question rather than an assumption. That is what makes its importance real. A myth does not teach much. Reality does. Malta mattered because it showed what a small position could do when geography, endurance, and operational purpose came together. It was not powerful in the way a battleship was powerful. It was not mobile like a carrier, could not maneuver away from danger, could not choose another sea, but it occupied the right place. And in war, the right place can become a force. From Malta, the Allies could threaten the Axis connection to North Africa. From Malta, aircraft and submarines could make the crossing costly. From Malta, intelligence could become action. From Malta, pressure could be applied not to the enemy's front line, but to the arteries feeding that front line. This is why the phrase unsinkable aircraft carrier has been used for island bases in many wars. But Malta was more than that phrase suggests. It was not only aircraft. It was harbors, repair shops, radar, command posts, shelters, hospitals, supply dumps, submarine pens, dock labor, civilian endurance, and the stubborn ability to restore function after damage. A carrier can sail away. Malta could not. Its immobility was vulnerability. Its immobility was also power. The Axis always knew where it was, but they could not make it stop being there. That difference shaped the Mediterranean War. Malta did not win North Africa alone. No serious account should claim that. The outcome depended on many forces: British and Commonwealth armies, American production, naval power, intelligence, Axis overextension, fuel shortages, air battles, command decisions, and the brutal fighting of men across the desert. But Malta was one of the pressure points that made the Axis position harder to sustain. It did not need to be the only cause to be decisive. A hinge is not the whole door, but remove it and the door changes. For Italian commanders, Malta became the lesson that a small base can impose a large cost if it sits in the correct place and survives long enough. It forced them to spend attention, fuel, escorts, aircraft, and planning capacity. It turned logistics into combat. It made the sea between Italy and Africa less like a route and more like a contested battlefield. And it showed something else. Modern war is not only decided by the most visible weapons. It is decided by systems that keep working under pressure. A fighter squadron matters, but so does the man who repairs the runway. A submarine patrol matters, but so does the harbor crew that gets the boat ready. A convoy matters, but so does the dock worker unloading before the next raid. A population matters when its endurance allows a military base to remain alive. This is the part that often gets lost. The island's legacy belongs not only to commanders and pilots, but to the ordinary people who made strategy possible by continuing to function while the world above them broke apart. They were not outside the battle. They were inside it. And when the war moved on to North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and beyond, Malta remained as evidence of a hard truth. Sometimes the most dangerous place on the map is not the largest one, or the strongest one, or the one with the most guns. Sometimes it is the place the enemy cannot afford to ignore, and cannot quite destroy. Not just an island. Return for a moment to Grand Harbor. August 15, 1942. The tanker Ohio, moving slowly through the water, held upright by ships pressed close beside her. Men watching ropes, pumps, hull plates, the uneasy line where steel met sea. Civilians standing near the harbor with hunger in their bodies and smoke still in their memories. The tanker was broken, but it had arrived. That image endures because it contains the larger truth of Malta. The island was damaged, but not finished. Weak but not useless. Hungry, but not silent. Surrounded, but still connected to the wider war by courage, ships, aircraft, submarines, and the stubborn labor of people who kept doing the next necessary thing. Italian commanders had believed Malta was a small island under pressure. A British outpost. A fortress that could be bombed. A harbor that could be blocked. A base that could be starved into irrelevance. There was reason to believe this. War is often planned through what appears reasonable. Distances, aircraft ranges, bomb tonnage, supply estimates, naval strength, political ambition. The map seemed to offer an answer, but what really happened was different. Malta became the place where geography turned into resistance. It became an island that reached beyond its shores. A base that influenced battles it never physically touched. A population whose endurance allowed aircraft to fly, submarines to sail, convoys to be unloaded, and Axis supply lines to remain under threat. The Axis could strike it. They could wound it. They could make life on the island harsh beyond easy description. But they could not change where it was. And because they could not change where it was, they could not escape what it did. Every convoy toward North Africa carried Malta in its calculations. Every escort assigned to protect shipping acknowledged Malta's influence. Every gallon of fuel lost at sea echoed later in the desert. Every delay became part of a wider weakening. Every attempt to suppress the island proved the same thing. Malta mattered too much to ignore and too stubbornly to erase. The tragedy is that understanding came late. Too late for the ships already lost. Too late for the men who drowned in burning water. Too late for the civilians buried beneath stone. Too late for the armies waiting in North Africa for supplies that did not arrive in time. War often punishes the difference between seeing and understanding. Italian commanders saw Malta early. They understood Malta late. They believed it was just an island. But what really happened was harsher, quieter, and far more important. Malta became a fixed blade in the middle of the Mediterranean. Not always sharp, not always strong, sometimes nearly broken, but still there, still cutting into the roots that kept an army alive. And in the end, that was enough. No island is small when every army must pass beneath its shadow. Final CTA. If you are watching from Malta, Italy, Britain, America, or anywhere connected to this history, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, sailed, flew, repaired, nursed, or simply endured during the war, you are welcome to leave their story there as well. For more forgotten World War II stories told through the gap between what commanders believed and what the battlefield revealed, subscribe to WW2 Warfront. History often turns on places people thought they understood.